Iran has executed the first of the protesters detained after participating in recent anti-government demonstrations. Mohsen Shekari was hanged on Thursday morning after being accused of wounding a security officer during the protests in September. Iranian courts have passed more death sentences. Just this week, 5 men have been sentenced to death, accused of killing a member of Iran's Revolutionary Guard.
Behind these walls in Tehran's Evin prison, a young man was reportedly executed. Iran's judiciary claims he injured a police officer during the protests. But observers say this was a show trial. It was broadcast in installments on state television. The 23-year-old had neither an independent legal defense nor the opportunity to challenge the verdict. Regardless, protests against the Iranian regime are still going on. For 3 days across multiple cities, many businesses have been on strike. People on the streets report a massive deployment of police and militias. Store owners, preferring to remain anonymous, say there have been targeted intimidation attempts. We were severely threatened. If we left the store closed, they would shut down our cafe completely. Iran's President Raisi continues to blame other countries' influences for the ongoing protests. He reiterated that point when he addressed pro-regime students at a Tehran university.
The West thinks we'll just hand the country over to the protesters. But no, the Iranian students would never let that happen.
Applause from his supporters. But the majority of students are his fiercest critics. Cell phone footage shows them protesting against Raisi and the regime outside the university. "You have no honor," they shout repeatedly, not only in the capital, but at universities all across the country. And the demonstrations show no sign of dying down.
Let's bring in Kamran Matin. He's a senior lecturer on international relations at the University of Sussex. Good to see you again. Mohsen Shekari had been sentenced less than a month ago. Reportedly, he was waiting for a chance to appeal his sentence, and his family wasn't made aware of his execution until it had already happened. Are you surprised the Iranian regime is moving so quickly?
No, I actually am not. I mean, various officials of the Islamic Republic and even a large number of MPs in the Iranian parliament have been calling for tougher action against the protesters. In the case of the MPs, they specifically asked for the use of the death sentence against protesters. So the government has been preparing this for a while, but we should remember that this is not something new in the Islamic Republic of Iran. Iran has already executed around 500 people during the course of 2022. And since the inception of the Islamist regime in 1979, execution has been one of the main instruments of intimidating society and suppressing the opposition. And there has been dramatic instances, for example, in summer of 1988, over the course of few months, several thousand political prisoners were executed. So this was always expected, but I very much doubt this would actually change much in terms of the protests.
Yeah, and in these circumstances, particularly, it's a double-edged sword for the regime, isn't it? On the one hand, they're seeking to intimidate protesters, but this is also certain to anger them even more. What do you expect to happen next?
Definitely, it will anger people more. I mean, you already see, despite this, people are coming out in different parts of Iran, different cities. What is more likely happen is that I think protesters and people more generally, I think, coming up with more innovative ways to express their protest. Only last 3 days, from Monday to Wednesday, we had 3 days of nationwide strike, which was remarkably widely observed across Iran. And in your clip, there was reference to how people are being threatened to reopen their businesses, otherwise they would be attacked. And, methods of protest such as strike are less costly in terms of direct confrontation with security forces, but their symbolic and actually economic effect can be quite huge. So while I think the tempo of the protest might go up and down depending on the circumstances, I think the underlying opposition and anger against the Islamic Republic and desire for a quite radical change in the political system remains lively and active, and we should expect more and more protests in the coming months.
Rights groups are calling on the international community now to act swiftly and with resolve to avoid further executions. What could stop the regime from killing more protesters?
I think more and more diplomatic pressure, especially from the international bodies such as UN, really is really important, because Islamic Republic, despite their rhetoric, gives importance to its status and image to some extent, and its ability to be present in international bodies. So very recently we had this Human Rights Commission of the United Nations launching a fact-finding mission regarding the brutality against the protesters in Iran. I think one way would be to expand the remit of this investigation and increase its powers and give it more legal power to actually bring the Iranian regime and particular individuals involved in this in the highest level into account. For example, the way in which, for example, EU acted in relation to the so-called Mykonos case in Germany in early 90s, mid-90s, could be kind of a model how to proceed with dealing with Iranian brutality and executions without due process, as we have witnessed in the case of Mohsen Shekari.
Kamran Matin of the University of Sussex, thank you for your time.
Thank you.
And for more, we can now speak to Hannah Neumann. She's a member of the European Parliament representing the Green Party and focusing, among other things, on human rights. Good to have you on the show. We've seen a lot of condemnation by European politicians reacting to this execution. Is that enough, in your opinion?
Good evening, Nicole. And what we saw today was the first execution that was also publicly announced, basically, by the regime as now they are going to execute one. And everyone is afraid that this will not be the first case. So it was good that we saw these many people standing up today with the public condemnations, Annalena Baerbock, German Minister of Foreign Affairs, and many others. But as you suggest, this cannot be enough. I'm, for example, looking forward to the Foreign Affairs Council of the European Union happening Monday, and I am expecting more sanctions.
Iran has been under sanctions for decades now, though, and it still hasn't changed its behavior. What makes the EU, and from the sound of it, yourself, believe that it would do so now?
What I would say is it is very important that we use all the tools that we have available at the moment to make the regime stop. This is public condemnations. It's a lot of attention and just building awareness about what they are doing in Iran, because we have seen in the past, once attention fades away, that is when the execution happens. It is sanctions. But yes, it is true. Our tools from the outside are also somehow limited. So we have to do everything we can, but also it would be wrong to believe that this would mean the tipping point. The change has to come from inside Iran.
Let's keep talking about those tools for a second, because protesters in Iran have long been asking Europe to expel Iranian diplomats and children of high-ranking officials who are enjoying a liberal life in the European Union. Why isn't that happening?
There are different opinions about expelling Iranian diplomats from the European Union. I have to say I'm a bit careful with this demand, because if we expel Iranian diplomats from the European Union, there is this kind of issue of reciprocity in foreign policy. So then we would give the regime the easiest of all excuses to kick out our own ambassadors, our own embassies from Iran. And they are at the moment doing crucial work inside the country that many human rights organizations want us to do, observing the trials, exerting pressure on the regime, supporting the protesters, for example, in finding a lawyer or getting at least halfway just process, supporting human rights defenders with raising their cases. And all of this would have to stop, or would stop, if our ambassadors would be kicked out. Also for us, they are an important source of information, so we do not have to trust the regime propaganda. No one of us wants to trust it, but we need then other sources of information, and our embassies are providing that for us.
Human rights associations and activists are warning that if there is no stark reaction, an immediate reaction by the international community, the Islamic Republic will continue executing its political prisoners. You say that there is a limit to what sanctions can achieve. So what could be a harsher reaction from the European Union to stop protesters from being killed?
We need more sanctions. We need clear political statements from all leaders of the European Union, but also from other countries such as the US, Canada, maybe even coming from other countries from the Arab world. We need to make them be accountable, for example, in UN fora, to question them, to always bring it about and really make sure that the spotlight doesn't move away from what is happening in Iran right now. That is what we can do.
Hannah Neumann, member of the European Parliament for the Greens, thank you so much.
You're welcome.